Welcome to episode 30 of the Necronama.com. The horror genre has a long history of mishandling mental health issues by treating them as a trope, whether as a plot device or an easy way to create a villain. This has perpetuated the stigma of mental illness, reinforced stereotypes, and increased fear of the unknown in persons who are not well educated in the realities of mental illness. It's only in recent years that horror has begun to really handle the subject of mental illness in a thoughtful way and truly included representation, as well as the horror of living with these conditions, as opposed to living near someone who is experiencing them. The depiction of mental illness in horror can be seen as early as the 1920s with The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, one of the first horror films to associate mental illness with being untrustworthy and possibly criminally insane. Flash forward to 1960, Alfred Hitchcock brings us the almighty Psycho, but in doing so gives us a main antagonist whose actions are a direct result of dissociative identity disorder. While cases where people with DID cause violence against others do exist, they are few and far between. But Psycho plays it up as a direct result, using the disorder as a way to justify the killer's craziness. One of the biggest issues with the portrayal of mental illness in horror is the way that it places an assumption in the mind instead of offering an understanding of how these disorders actually work. In the last decade, things have begun to turn. We've started to look at the horror of living with these issues, as opposed to using mental illness as a scapegoat or an origin story for a killer. And we've learned that there are ways around these monsters that don't involve destroying them. 2014's The Babadook focuses on a woman coping with the death of her husband and blaming her son for said death. The Babadook itself becomes an embodiment of her pain. She can only move on from it when she learns to live with it rather than thinking she can stop it. It will always be a part of her. As more films like The Babadook start exploring mental illness in a different way, I think we'll really dig into the horror of being the one with the condition instead of the one threatened by the one with the condition. There are people the whole world over who suffer from a variety of mental illnesses and disorders, and as writers and filmmakers, we owe it to them to provide education and accurate representation of mental illness. As long as our society insists on trying to ignore these things and seeing them as weakness, people will seek out an understanding of them through books and film, and we can either give them the criminally insane and the extremely dangerous threatening to harm others, or we can look at the realities around us and offer true representation of what people are dealing with daily. The horror genre is still a long ways off from giving us excellent portrayals of mental health, but the genre has the power to generate empathy and understanding. These positive changes are coming slowly, but they're definitely happening. Today, author Chris Vander Kaay joins us to talk about one of these films that is working really hard to subvert our expectations when it comes to the portrayal of mental illness in horror. This is They Look Like People. I am James Sabata, horror author, screenwriter, co-host of the podcast you're listening to right now, and while I'm not convinced that everyone around me is a demon, I know Don is.
Wait, are you trying to say I'm a demon, or I'm convinced? Anyway, I am Don Guillory, horror.
I'll edit it out. Keep going.
Okay. I'm Don Guillory, author, historian, educator, co-host of this podcast that you are listening to. And yeah, I've got a few demons running around me, and I'm always trying to avoid them. But enough about the squirrels on campus.
Oh, man. So joining us today is author Chris Vander Kaay. Chris, you want to tell us a bit about yourself and what you do and where people can find you and all that good info?
Have you ever had a guest say, no, I don't want to talk about myself?
That would be amazing. Do that.
Right? Yeah. Well, I'm not going to buck that trend. Yeah, my name is Chris Vander Kaay. I am an author, raconteur, dilettante, demon, as you were aforementioned. I'm a filmmaker as well, and a lot of actually what I write in book form relates to the film world. And the circuit that I'm doing right now, which you guys were kind enough to let me come on and talk about, is for a book that is going to be coming out in March called Spoiler Alert, which is the subtitle is The Badass Book of Movie Plots. And basically, me and my co-writers decided we thought it would be really fun to make a book of templates for the cliches and the tropes that come up in popular Hollywood movies. So we picked 38 genres for this first book and basically created almost like infographic style templates for how you would write various films: costume drama, alien invasion movie, spaceship thriller, Christmas film, stuff like that.
Okay.
Very cool.
It's sweetly satirical, I'll say. We poke fun, but in love.
Oh, man. So I know that you've listened to a couple of our episodes in the past. We talked about this before you came on. So you know that the first question I'm going to ask you is why you picked the film that you've picked. So you want to run us through that?
Yes. One of the things I didn't list amongst dilettante and author is I consider myself to be something of a curator of indie horror film. And when I say indie, I don't mean something premiered at Sundance that's getting some buzz. I mean, I sifted through Amazon Prime for 7 hours and kept following the algorithm further and further down. Customers also watched until I get to movies no one has watched, to try and find good movies, maybe not super expensive ones, but ones that have great performances or really scary moments or have something interesting to say, but just didn't find their audience. And I stumbled across this one, which actually did play at several festivals and did fairly well, but it's a micro budget film. They Look Like People. Pretty much just has a 3-person cast. And the second I saw the trailer, I thought, I watch a lot of garbage trailers. And this one, I can tell it's inexpensive, but not in a way that hinders your enjoyment of the film. And so I watched it, and I was just really blown away with how much they were able to accomplish in a thematic and storytelling way with so little in terms of performances and money that they spent, and really sort of the logistics of the project is very contained, but they were talking about a lot within that very contained project. So I always love those kinds of movies.
Well, and even the way it's shot is very, very great for a indie film. Like it's quality shooting, and it looks good. You know, a lot of indie films don't have that. They kind of feel like, you know, it was shot on a cell phone sometimes. Mm-hmm. And this one, like, I wouldn't have known it was indie if I didn't know going into it. You know, like it just played to me like a budget was behind it.
Mm-hmm. Well, it gives you that fly on the wall type perspective where there were moments in this, because I like a lot of what I like to term trash TV and reality TV, to where some of the interactions that were taking place between the characters, I felt like it was any of the, you know, the reality shows I was watching, but it wasn't like the scripted part of the reality. It was kind of like, what are you doing? Oh, I'm just making a sandwich. You want one? You know, and kind of like that interaction that takes place between friends that you don't typically think about, or even catching a glance of somebody that you're interested in, or somebody who's interested in you, and you know, kind of the embarrassment or the shock that comes with it, as far as like, oh shit, I hope they didn't know I was looking at them, or what I was thinking about, or, you know, anything else like that. You know, beyond some of the psychological stuff that the film gets into with the characters.
For sure. I think one of the things that's interesting, and it sort of builds off what you're saying, is how much this movie does in small moves. You know, it's so much about, like you said, the furtive glances and the quiet dialogue, but also the size of the story is really pared down to the sort of the absolute necessities of the interaction. I mean, you're essentially looking at 3 points of a relationship, and we're only watching at any one scene 2 of those points interacting, except for a couple of moments where a third one's introduced. But for the most part, we're watching a series of 2-person moments happening, and there's only 3 characters total. So it's interesting that they were able to get all of the shades of emotion and story out of essentially a triangular narrative, you know, where only 3 characters are interacting with each other. All credit in the world to Perry Blackshear, who was I believe the writer, director, producer. I think he may have shot it himself. I think he did
and edited it himself as well.
Yeah. So this is really sort of like a Shane Carruth style, you know, primer, $6,000, go and make it yourself kind of project. And I was just sort of bowled over with how much he was able to get accomplished.
For me, indie films tend to walk one of two directions. There's either all these great ideas and you can't understand why this wasn't heavily funded, or there's, hey, you had a really good idea here. What did you do? Mm-hmm. And this film, in some ways, walks a really thin line between the two for me. But for the most part, it's on that first side of just being amazed, again, that they didn't have the budget, that they didn't have this massive team behind this, because their understanding of emotion and stuff, like you were saying, is just mind-blowingly good. And the pacing was a little slow for me in parts, but I think that also really reflects the mental illness stuff that we're going to get to in a bit. So, yeah, overall, I think it definitely accomplished things that I wouldn't expect a sleeper indie movie to be able to accomplish, like you're saying.
No, was this a first time watch for both of you guys?
Yes, for me, yes.
Yeah, and full disclosure, I used to teach a screenwriting course. We'll probably be teaching a screenwriting course again, but I have shown in my class, I think I've shown this 3 different times to classes, specifically because all of these kids coming up, especially nowadays, if they want to be screenwriters, they're likely going to have to at least be independent filmmakers to start with. And so I said, listen, if you want to be able to tell a solid story that shows your writing skills, but also your directing skills, look at a project like this that does so much with so little.
Well, and I mean, even if you look at like the Blumhouse model, where they're doing bigger budget stuff, but it's still a small budget comparatively, like one of our friends, Rebecca McKendry, she always talks about how she will take a monster movie that you made with no budget over the big budget stuff, because you have to be more inventive. You have to show what you can do with this. And when you can make these little tiny budgets stretch and make something great, we know we can trust you with a shit ton of money. And I think that in itself is a great lesson for anybody who's trying to get into this.
Yeah. Well, and studio films have followed suit, right? I mean, how many people have gotten gigs? I mean, Shazam, Guardians of the Galaxy, these were all little indie film. I mean, even Jurassic World, they were all filmmakers who made tiny independent films and then got bumped up when people saw they could make something out of, relatively little.
Well, even the budget increase from Get Out to Us, and Jordan Peele had a lot of name power going into it. And the budget was still more than twice as big with the second movie because he proved he could deliver. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, having that doesn't guarantee you a big budget. So somebody like myself, for instance, isn't going to get that budget. So learning these techniques and figuring out how to make this stuff work with nothing is so huge. So I think that's a great lesson. And I'm glad that you're showing it to the next generation of filmmakers.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and what we're going to talk about here in a minute, the thematics of the film also make a huge difference to me, because you can make a really good, really effective horror film, but if it's not saying anything deeper than the sort of the surface scares, it doesn't really have the repeat viewability or that emotional resonance that brings you back to it. Whereas I think this movie actually had a lot to say, and I think that's one of the reasons why I revisit it in my class as well.
Absolutely. So why don't we jump into that? Why don't you take us to the first thematic part you'd like to talk about?
Sure. Well, I mean, I feel like there's probably a lot more meat on this bone than maybe we'll even get to within the hour. But I think the first and foremost, the thing that I thought was really effective about this movie is its portrayal of mental illness. Especially in the horror and thriller genres. Mental illness equates to the other, right? The monster, the creep, the killer, the whatever. And even if they're not the killer, there's always some sort of like over the top version of a person if they have some sort of mental illness. And the thing I loved about this movie is that aside from the moments where he was having his breaks, he was a super likable character. He was compelling. He was friendly. He cared about the people in his life. And he was a normal human being, which you don't really see in portrayals of mental illness in movie all that much.
Yeah, absolutely. I've worked in the behavioral health field for the last 20 years, and it's very rare to find any positive portrayal of mental illness. It's used a lot as a scapegoat. It's used to, give people enough trauma to be evil. I'm talking about everything, man. But yeah, sure, you can go there. But, it's so always used as an excuse to make a villain. So I kind of like that while they sort of went there, they didn't. And that was very refreshing.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
So even the way they address it initially, where he has that moment about like, oh, they say I'm schizophrenic, but I'm not really schizophrenic. And then you see kind of this, I hate to refer to it as a descent, but it's really how he's dealing emotionally and psychologically with the paranoia that he feels about, the coming invasion of something. There's something that's coming. And he doesn't know, one, who he can talk to about it, because he's told, don't tell anybody about this, which for me and for anybody else who's dealing with any type of mental illness or any mental health issues, the one thing that people always, or at least what society kind of has framed it now, the language is changing and kind of the acceptance is changing. But the idea that if you have something that's quote unquote wrong with you, don't tell anybody about it, because then they're going to treat you like you're different. They're going to treat you like you're broken. They're going to treat you as though you're flawed in somehow, or you'll end up pushing people away and you'll become more isolated, which, you kind of see with him when he's, working in the basement and trying to figure out how to deal with, killing these beings that might show up. He's having to deal and struggle with this by himself until near the end. But we'll get to that.
Yeah, well, I think an interesting observation to make in this, like you said, James, is that they're not really scapegoating him in the way that they frequently do in horror films, because at least within the confines of the film itself, he never causes any physical harm to another human being. And
that's a good point.
Yeah, I mean, we're scared at many moments that it could happen. But even as much as he's pushed to think something horrible's happening around him, we never once witness him physically assaulting anyone. In fact, I think it's a clever little irony. It's a nice touch that the only on-screen quote-unquote violence is actually when Mara is having a fake sparring match with Christian in the park, and then later when Wyatt is trying to talk to her and she doesn't want to talk to him and basically just sort of throat punches him. So I think it's really funny that she was the only one to exhibit any sort of violence, and it was in a defensive way. And other than that, neither of the main characters really exhibited any overt physical violence towards anyone, which is unheard of for a horror film for the most part.
It's very true. I want to talk really fast about the friendship between Christian and Wyatt, because I think that it plays heavily into what we're talking about. And I know I'm going to kind of go into a different theme here, but we'll bring it back. Male bonding is always shown, not always, but mostly shown in very different ways in other films. So I loved that they're completely sensitive with each other. They're goofy with each other. They aren't afraid to open up to each other eventually. Like they have that moment at the beginning where they're kind of like getting to know each other again and they're playing stupid games and that kind of thing while they're both suffering. But they get to the point where they're able to really open up to each other. And I loved that was so powerful in this film. And I think that plays into the mental illness parts as well, because it really showed how you can care for somebody even when you can't help them, and B, in reverse, like it really plays into the end of the film, obviously. But it was so nice and refreshing to see a very different portrayal of males bonding for once. How did you guys feel about that?
Well, I love the fact, because especially when you and I were talking about this earlier, that idea of this hyper masculine, typical way that male friendships are defined in a lot, or expressed in a lot of these movies. You mentioned them playing around in was the game with the sheets where they're playing goobers or goobles or something. Blobbies. Yeah. Where they were just, they just put on sheets and they ran into each other, goofing around, and you could see them as kids. Like, at that moment you're like, oh shit, I could see myself playing this type of thing as kids. And watching the film, for me, when I realized, was like, well, when the fuck did we get to this point where, as far as adolescence or adulthood, when you just kind of just didn't play anymore? Because my wife was watching it with me, and I said, I don't remember the last time that I just went out and said, oh, I'm just going to take a basketball and go, go run a game or do something. But I remember distinctly doing it when I was in middle and high school. I don't even recall having that type of stuff in college because it just seems that, we got too busy or there were things, going on in life where it's kind of, I can't just go out and have fun and, play a game just to play. But that pickup game that they were, or the game of one-on-one they were playing each other, was real indicative of their friendship, because I don't even think they finished the game, or at least there was no indication that they finished the game, because they're playing and then they stop and they have their conversation and then you see them walking home, because it seems like, hey, I need to confide in you about this. And, whereas when they started, it was kind of like, oh, man, I'm going to beat you this time. You kicked my ass, for 10 years. It's my turn. It's my turn to win. But it didn't turn into this thing where either one of them felt like I have to beat you. It was more an issue of, man, I'm going to do it this time. Like when you have an older brother or a younger sibling and there's that moment of, oh, man, they've been kicking my butt every time we go out here. So I'm going to get them this one time. If I win once, that's going to be good enough for me. But yeah, the friendship that they have that's on display in this film. I think it's something that's going to be good for people to watch. And it's unexpected, especially in a horror film, or I would just say unexpected in a lot of ways, because it's showing two grown men as friends, innocent friends. One's not holding anything over the other one. One's not scheming anything. There's not a woman that's involved as far as like, oh, man, I liked her first, and they're competing and they stop being friends and they have this moment where they finally have some resolution to become friends again. It's just simply that they're vulnerable with each other. They can be friends and basically say, this is who we are.
Yeah, I mean, it's rare to see a movie where a male relationship isn't based in some way on conflict or competition.
Right.
And even when they were playing basketball, like you said, they weren't really keeping track of it. I think it's interesting. This is definitely an intentional read on the director's part, I think, too, because they juxtapose that with the way that Christian's character at work is sort of exemplified. He's trying to embrace those sort of toxically masculine traits, right? Like he's listening to the things that are telling him that he's going to dominate and he's superior. And it's funny because that's the place in his life in which he's failing. That's the place where the most trouble comes from. And that's the place where he's evoking that problematic male competitive edge, and it's failing for him. But when his guard is down, when he's just being friends with his friend and there's no ulterior motive, he ends up being ultimately successful with what happens in the story because he becomes sort of pacifist, because he's unwilling to confront and be violent. That's actually the thing that his friend needed, was for him to not do that.
Yeah. And I mean, to me, that really all of that plays in so much with how the mental health aspect is presented, because we do get this sympathetic character, and it's not the sympathetic character we would normally get in this situation, which would be a motherly type or a girlfriend type, definitely a female type. Like, I cannot think of an example where it's a male who is this supportive character, and the only supportive character, rather, like the one who's really, really trying to help him once he kind of realizes what's going on. So, yeah, I mean, in those ways, I think that the friendship is completely tied into the mental health aspect, and that's why I wanted to go there so early. With that said, I just really appreciated how that reinforces that they were friends before this. It's not some random guy that he found. It's like if my best friend from high school, Andy, showed up. Like, we still kind of degenerate to those people that we were. Like, we still have that bond. We come back to the bullshit that's going on today, but we still do things that we did in high school to kind of rekindle that and just escape from where we are for a little bit. So, yeah.
I also think generationally, one of the things that what you're saying builds on in the film is that the reason that they're able to connect so importantly as adults is because when they connected as children, it was it was a genuine human connection. One of the things that's interesting when you see them as adults is one or the other is always being pulled away by a technology. There's a voice in a machine talking to them instead of them talking to a human, right? It's Wyatt is hearing the voice, the voice that's actually in his head, but he's hearing it through the cell phone. And then the voice that Christian is hearing, he created his own, but it's also a voice that's talking to him in his head. And these are both things that are actually pulling them away from society, pulling them away from their relationships. And in a way, it's the removal of those two pieces and letting those friends come back together that ends up sort of, to a degree, curing both of their ills.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and you also have the aspect that each one has to admit that they need something. Christian is very lonely. And so whether he directly says it or not, he has to admit to himself he wants a friend with him. And that's why he brings him in, And then you have Wyatt, who has every reason in his head telling him to get out of the city, do this, do that. But there's that part of him that's missing. And he also, again, whether it's verbal or not, has to admit that to himself. And that's why he's hanging on to Christian. And I like that they both have to be vulnerable to accept that about themselves in order for the thing that makes it all work to be there, if that makes sense.
No, for sure. I mean, in interesting ways, that characters are actually parallels of each other, because they're sort of drawing this parallel between schizophrenia, which is what Wyatt's dealing with, and I guess you would call it sort of self-help, self-delusion that Christian has created for himself. Like there's one character seeing things that are genuinely not real in the case of Wyatt, but the other one is also kind of constructing this false worldview for himself that he's trying to bring about, and so it's interesting that both of them need the other one to help them shatter the false view of the world that they either have created themselves or have, in Wyatt's case, had sort of forced on him by, chemistry. And so I think that's an interesting parallel.
Yeah, definitely. All right. What else do you have that you want to go into?
Well, I also think that there's interestingly, we talked a bit about the idea of toxic masculinity, but I think this film cleverly sort of subverts all of the expected woman in peril tropes.
Yes.
In really smart ways. In fact, one of my favorites is everybody knows what they should expect when the guy with mental illness asks the innocent woman if she wants to go down to the basement, right? We all know where we think that scene is leading.
Exactly. Yeah.
And what's brilliant about it is it goes absolutely in no way like you think it would. I don't want to say it's anticlimactic. It is, but in such a powerful way, because you have appreciation for the female character who basically stands her ground and he backs out of the way. But then it helps to continue to humanize Wyatt, because he's not a monster. He genuinely thought she was the one talking to him, and his worldview was just a little bit shattered when he found out it wasn't. So he wasn't trying to assault her. He was trying to understand. And when she told him to back off, he did. Like, he's still a human being, and he still understands how to interact with humans. It's just this other thing is going on with him. And I thought, what a clever way to not only subvert that trope, but also to deepen both characters by doing so.
Yeah, because if this had been another movie, it would have been, oh, my cover's blown, now I have to kill you, and then the friend comes down and finds out that he's killed Mara, and it turns into something else. Which, it is. It's great that it doesn't go that way, and it actually gives Wyatt this way to definitely demonstrate to the audience that he's not dangerous in that sense that we would expect in this type of film.
Yeah, for sure.
You said it was anticlimactic, and I agree. When I watched it, I was like, I don't want to say bored. That's not the right word for it. But I was sitting there like, that's it? And now as you're saying this, like, it's so much more powerful to me. So, yeah, I'm definitely going to pay attention to that if I watch it again. That's fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah. And how that moment echoes later with where he tries to talk to her on the street, and literally, I don't know that he puts his hands on her. I can't remember, but he may put his hand on her shoulder or something, and then she punches him and he just immediately drops to the ground. And then the next moment we see they're sitting in a diner. She kind of feels bad about having punched him, and he's basically just got a bloody nose. And there's something about that that's powerful for me, because what this movie is, as much as it is its own narrative, it's also kind of a kick in the pants and a reminder to other storytellers to say there are ways to tell this same framework of story without leaning on the tropes that unintentionally continue to sort of put out a worldview that is problematic for both of these characters, for a character that's mentally ill and for a female character, right? We have specific ideas of how both of them will act in a scene that's written in a horror film. And this movie very effectively found a way to tell a story that didn't use any of them.
Yeah, and it really reiterates, the experiences of women that would put that in their head to begin with, because they do deal with this all the time. So no, I can't take chances that you're a good guy. I gotta save myself. And I think that it's a really strong way to show that without going into it all. Whereas some films would be like, let's show her get attacked at the beginning so we know why she's a strong woman later. And they didn't do that. They just like you just understand, reality for one, and just, that the experiences are there that make her not trust him.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, they also created her as a character who's very self-sufficient. When we first meet her, she's Christian's boss. She's in charge. So I like that, like from the moment that we met her, we understood what the power dynamic was. And the movie doesn't do anything to upend that. Like they don't ever turn to the point where, oh, she was in power and now she's the weak one. It never shifts in that direction. And I like that. I like that she has agency throughout the entire film. And it's really the relationship between the two friends that alters their circumstance, not because there's an external victim that comes between them.
So I just rewatched the scene because I was curious whether he touched her or not. And he's literally, he's talking to her and she's pulling away. And then he goes to touch her and she says, if you touch me, I'll kill you, or something like that. I don't know. I had it on mute right now. And she turns and he touches her elbow just barely. And that's when she flips around and punches him in the face.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's a powerful moment, too, because while we sympathize with Wyatt, we don't want to see him beat up. We also recognize fully and perhaps more are in her camp, as far as we've seen he was pointing a nail gun at people in this film. Right. So we get it. It makes total sense, which means we should always have an understanding of what women are facing every single time a man walks up and invades their personal space. That this movie in some ways is a really good empathy machine because it allows you to be inside the heads of three different characters who are all dealing with very different life circumstances that, as a result of that, have given them a specific way that they react to the world. Hers is defensive and understandably so. Wyatt has pulled back from the world, understandably so. And Christian has put forth this false impression of himself in order to deal with reality. And the smart thing about the film is it helps us to connect and relate to all of them, even while we see what the problem is with the way that they connect with the world.
Yeah, definitely. I think that that's very powerful and really well done in this.
So one thing I was curious, I would love to ask both of you guys about to see what you thought, because one of my favorite aspects of this movie, they clearly didn't have a lot of money to spend on visual effects. There's a couple of tiny moments where there's clearly some visual effects. But for the most part, what makes this movie unnerving for me is the soundscape. And I was curious how you guys responded to that as well.
Oh, yeah. Well, it felt, like I said earlier, it felt like I was watching them in a natural state, as far as, you call it with reality TV or what, not unscripted reality TV, to where it's a film where it almost seems like it's people watching. You don't need all the music playing. You don't need the special effects that are going in, the special effects noises that are going in. Aside from the one time you see that face change, and I think even the photograph that gets used. Mm-hmm. I was never I wasn't taken out during those moments, but I never had the opportunity to be taken out of the film because the music didn't. We talked about Last House on the Left. I didn't have a moment like that with this film where the music took me out or drove my senses in a way to amplify how I was going to feel about a scene. Mm-hmm. I'm sure I would probably feel more anxious if Wyatt takes Mara down into the basement and there's some spooky music or some high tension music that's playing while he's trying to tell her about the mission that he's on and that he's doing a good job and whatever else may come up. But I like the fact that they didn't They didn't need that to tell you the story.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and that's a big part because it's leaving it up to you. And a lot of movies work too hard to tell you how to feel. And that's another thing this movie does great.
Yeah. I think when I mentioned the idea of the soundscape being so unnerving to me, one of the things that I thought that the movie smartly did was to figure out how to make, I guess you could call it, like, the movie is in some ways about the danger of the human voice, like the ways in which it controls us, it manipulates us, it scares us. Like the moment, I think it's the opening moments, right, where Wyatt's laying in bed and he's looking at his wife rolls over, her face is in shadow. We don't see anything of her face, but we start to hear this sound.
Yeah, the
and
crunching.
Crunching. It almost sounds like either something is being chewed or maybe something is changing shape. We don't ever see what's going on with her face. It's shrouded in darkness, but because of the sound, our mind is going all kinds of places. And then very effectively later, they do the same thing with the human voice, where moments that should maybe be creepy are not, or vice versa. Like I thought a really effective sequence was where the first moment where you start to see Mara and Christian connect alone after the first
in the
date.
whisper room.
In the whisper room, exactly. I thought that was a really powerful scene because there's no music, there's no other sound except for their two voices. And if you pay close attention to the audio, they even mixed it. She's closest to the mic and her voice is dominant, even though she's whispering, and his voice is getting lost. And I think that's a very clever sound mix in that moment, because all he's like sort of helplessly holding his hand out, and she's commanding the conversation in most of the ways because he's sort of taken by the fact that she wants to touch his hand. And so his soundscape has told us everything we need to know about the power position of the characters in the scenes. And I think the same thing is true with a lot of Wyatt's phone calls. When he gets the calls, you know, every voice, no matter what shape it takes, whether it's that monstrous noise at the beginning or then it becomes Mara's voice, and then I think towards the end it becomes what we assume to be his ex's voice. Each one of them has some sort of, like, the mix on it is such that it doesn't sound the way that a normal voice would sound coming through a phone, you know. I think that's an interesting choice.
You know, when I was watching that scene, I was texting James, like, I hate ASMR. I hate it. And in fact, that when you talk about unnerving, I completely forgot about that one scene. But yeah, that itself bothered me, not necessarily because of the power dynamics, but for me, just ASMR to me is what fingers on a chalk or fingernails on a chalkboard are to other people. It's just one of those things that I can't do it.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and I feel like there are certain sequences of this film where it's painted all over it, you know, where it's clear, even in sequences like I think the moment where Wyatt sees Mara towards the end, where he sees her as having turned into something, where she's doing her nails are clicking on the table where the blood is sort of underneath her fingers.
Right.
There's again no music in the moment with the fingers. We're just hearing the clicking of the fingers and the nails on the table, and to for me at least, to similar effect. It's because, like you said, the basement sequence. Maybe it could have been scarier if there'd been scary music in it, but for me, I'm more frightened because you're not giving me the cue that tells me where you're going. So I don't actually know where this is going. I could have some guesses, but like I don't have musical cues, I don't have standard character cues, and it's the same in that moment where you see the blood. Like we're not getting. Normally, you'd get the sort of the jump chord, the scare moment, or some shocked reaction from him. But because it's so muted, because it's brought down, and we're literally just hearing what we would imagine to be like the tactile, physical sounds of the moment, it kind of unnerves you a bit. It's like I'm not sure. Am I seeing it from Wyatt's point of view? Is this what's happening right now? Mm-hmm. And it's effectively unnerving because of it, I think.
You know, in some ways, that in and of itself is very reflective of mental illness and how things feel, and the disconnect from other humans. And I don't know if that's purposeful, but that's a really interesting thing I'm going to think more about.
Yeah, I would love to actually ask Perry Blackshear if he knows anyone or is connected in any way to people who have this type of mental illness, because the thing I found refreshing about the movie, and I think I mentioned it earlier, is like oftentimes people in movies with mental illness will be portrayed as they are crazy 100% of the time, 24 hours a day, and you just can't be around them. They're out of their minds. And what I thought was really effective is, particularly with the disease that he has, it's not like that all the time. There are times when it becomes worsened, and then there are times when it ebbs. And I loved that in a way, the movie almost it wasn't saying this, but I love how, like, in the same way that a werewolf turns into a werewolf at night and then he's a normal guy when the day comes around, or there's something to the idea of where Wyatt, most of the time it was at night, he was having these issues, these episodes, the phone calls outside or going into the basement, or where he almost attacked Christian in the living room after they had the night of drinking. But then the next morning, he's, lovable Wyatt again. And I thought that was a fantastic balance, because you have to believe that in order for Christian to want to be around him, and in order for this guy to be able to navigate the world, he's a normal guy for most of the time, except when this thing is affecting him. And I thought that that's the thing you don't see most of the time in movies, is the rest of the time.
I actually also made the connection with sundowners, which is when certain mental illnesses kick in more when the sun goes down, right? And it was the counting down to 6 o'clock that really got me. I was like, it's interesting. I wonder if that's where they were going with this, or, because it does mostly happen at night. So I don't know. It really stood out to me, having dealt with mental illness so much in my life through friends, family, my own stuff, and of course my 20 years in behavioral health. It's one of those things where you always know that you're more likely to have an episode when the sun's gone. And so I would love to know if all of that was purposeful, or if it's just, some horror movies just make it night all the time because it's scarier.
Right.
So,
although I would argue that some of the most effective quote unquote scare moments in the film, the scene with her fingers on the blood, the scene with him on the roof with the nail gun, many of them happen in broad daylight. And that's also a surprise for a horror film, to be that effectively unnerving in broad daylight where you can see everything.
That's one of my favorite horror movies is An American Werewolf in London. And they do a lot of that, of the juxtaposition of showing things during the day. And it's so much creepier. And I wish that more horror movies would take a note of that and do it correctly, I guess. I don't know. I'm scared of shit all the time, 24 hours a day. So it doesn't have to be nighttime.
Right, exactly. Most of the time that horror movies take place, the rest of us are actually asleep. So the things we're scared of, we get scared of during the day.
Very true.
But you mentioned the scene in the basement there at the end, when I guess we could get to the culmination of the story, which is essentially that Wyatt thinks that this whole thing is going to pop off at 6 o'clock. Whatever this crazy takeover is of these things that have been getting inside of human beings, he thinks the shit is hitting the fan at 6 o'clock. And so he thought they were going to be able to drive out of town. They weren't able to make it. So he asked Christian to go down into the basement with him, and they have to for some reason, Wyatt knows he'll be fine, but he's worried about Christian being taken over. And this is sort of plays back into what we were talking about with the sound and how effective the sound is he basically puts Christian in this costume, covers his mouth with a sock, and then tapes a sock in his mouth, puts a bag over his head. And from the moment that the bag goes over his head, the whole sequence where Wyatt is sort of counting down until the time is coming and watching the bag. If you guys go back and watch that scene, because there was one time I was showing it to a class and the sound cut out because I was streaming it live, and the sound cut out for the last couple of minutes. When you watch that sequence with no sound, it is not frightening at all. In fact, it's a little bit comical that there's a guy just sort of slowly turning his head sideways back and forth with the bag on.
Right.
It only works because of the soundscape that Blackshear and the team created for what we imagine is happening underneath that bag, because otherwise it's just a guy sort of saying no with a bag on his head. It's only that sound that turns it into something frightening.
That's interesting.
And I think it feeds back into the larger theme he was doing throughout the whole film, which is that it's almost nothing that we see that's frightening. There's the picture, yes, and then when he sees Mara, yes, but it's mostly the haunting idea of what if, combined with the things that are being said to him. Like, I think there's one line was my favorite line of the movie. I can't remember exactly what it was, but there was when the voice says to him, using his ex's voice, says, when we open you and your friend up and we splay your bodies out on the ground like a moist, wet tree or something like that. Like he was basically talking about like laying your veins out on the ground. And I just remember thinking that would look ridiculously gory and over the top in a film, but just saying it is really effective. Like, it's more effective that I heard a character say it than if I had seen it on screen. And I think that's sort of the ethos of this whole film, is he knew we don't have a lot of money for visual effects. So how do we unnerve people just with sound and inference and the idea of the sort of the ramifications of what people are saying?
Yeah, because then it's in your head as far as like, what does that look like? And in a lot of cases, whatever we imagine, it is frightful enough. But if you show it to us, that mystery goes away. There's this moment where, that whatever you might have been afraid of, it might have been worse than what you're seeing on screen now, as opposed to, oh, that actually looks goofy.
Right. Well, it's like, that generation of children who, when they were adults, swore that they were scarred by the scene where they saw Bambi's mother be shot. Nobody ever saw Bambi's mother be shot, but
right.
We all remember that we did. Yeah. Yeah. I'm also curious what you guys thought. This may be apparent from watching the film, but I talked to one of the actors. I believe it was Evan Demoshel, who plays Christian, but it might have been Wyatt. I'm not sure, because it was whoever runs the They Look Like People Twitter account. I actually wrote to them when I was teaching the film in the class, and I said, do you guys have a copy of the script? Because I would love to show it to my students so they can compare on the page to on the screen. And he said, let me talk to Perry and I'll get back to you. And eventually what he came back to me with was, he said, we don't really have anything we can show you, because what was on the page isn't mostly dialogue wise whatever ended up on the screen. We had sequences mapped out. We knew the character intentions, and we had some sketches of dialogue. But essentially this was invented to a degree in the moment, in the interactions between the characters, which I think feeds into what you were saying about that almost like reality show realness to their interactions, because a lot of it was not unscripted in the sense that he just started shooting and said, figure it out, but unscripted in the sense that they had an emotional arc for what the scene was going to be, but didn't map out every beat of what everyone said. And I think that actually, for my money, when you're working in a low budget film, if you don't have pitch perfect actors, sometimes that's a better way to go, because then a person is reacting the way they naturally would, and you're going to get a better performance than if you're asking people who've never acted to try and realistically portray dialogue you wrote without having them in mind for it,
Well, and even having written short films and had people create them and do it, like, nobody says the line the way you wrote it. Even if you're on set telling them how you want it said, it's still going to be them. So I agree. I think a lot of times it's so much better to have, this is what the characters are talking about, and let the actors go. I mean, the greatness of Arrested Development is so much improv, So I think it works really well when people understand their characters and really go for it. And I mean, if that's what happened here, they did a great job, because I wouldn't have known that. And I love the chemistry between people. And I think that really comes from that basically improving feel,
Yeah. Well, and I definitely think this crew worked well together. I mean, I know for sure that they did, because they made a film. Actually, I think it's last month. It just came out in January. It was originally called The Rusalka, which is a Russian term. They changed it to The Siren because it's more sellable, I guess. But it's the same director, writer, creator, Perry Blackshear, and it's the same three actors. So it's another three-hander, and it's another sort of, I guess this one's a little closer to sort of like a dark fairy tale, and it's sort of out in the country by a lakeside. So it's interesting because it's almost kind of a flip side to this one. And I think that the actress, Margaret Ying Drake, is the main character, and the other guys are supporting characters. But clearly they really liked the dynamic that they had together and what they produced, because they followed it up with another film, less than a year or two later they've been shooting. So,
Don, do you have anything to add?
Well, I do have one thing, and that had to deal with, I guess, the interaction between Christian and Mara. That scene that it kind of made me laugh and smile because of what was taking place, where she was teaching them jujitsu or judo, I believe.
Right.
Anyway,
yeah. Judo.
She was teaching them how, some self-defense and talking about the rear naked choke and all this other stuff. And I thought about how, things like that take place in where there's this flirtatious thing behind it, or this friendly thing behind it. And I think I was messaging James. I said, this movie re-traumatized me, because we were having something like this in Army combatives, where you're supposed to learn how to choke somebody out and all this other stuff. And in this This other officer I was training with, she's like, I can't get it. I can't get my arms around somebody's neck to put the rear naked choke on. And so I jokingly said to her, it's really not that big of a deal. It's you do this, do this, do this. I said, here, you should be able to choke me out. And what we were always told was, what'll happen is if you're being choked out, here's when you need to tap out. If you start seeing stars. And all these little bouts that we had and these times that it was known as rolling with somebody never happened. This other officer who was half my size, if that, I've told her, it was like, jump on my back, put your arm here, put the crook of your elbow right against my windpipe, right up under my neck by my windpipe, and said, and then what you do is you just lean back a little bit and breathe and squeeze. And as she did that, she's like, do I have it? I'm like, yeah, you got it. You're doing good. And then I started looking, because it was pitch black when we were out, because it was really early in the morning, like 4 o'clock or something when we were doing our training. And all of a sudden I was like, shit, there are a lot of stars out. And within 2 seconds, I'm like, I'm tapping out, letting her like, hey, it's good. And so that scene where Christian is basically being choked by Mara, where she's showing him how to do it, I was laughing. I'm like, it wouldn't happen that fast. But I do, but then I started thinking, it's like, no, he's probably just flirting with her, trying to find some way to actually talk to her. Which for me, that scene was reassuring, because it's starting to show how normal, and I know James hates this, but I think that's at least what those who are creating this film were doing, trying to show how normal interactions take place between people. He may not have been trying to, go anywhere with her at that moment, but at least he was trying to have some interaction with her to be accepted, to do something to where, he felt safe and secure with her. But, I found it funny that it had to deal with self-defense and judo and chokeholds.
Yeah, and it's funny that you bring up that scene. It reminded me comically of the Wesley versus Fezzik the Giant scene in The Princess Bride.
Oh, yes.
But yeah, another thing about that scene that I feel like cleverly subverts that trope that we always see in these kinds of movies, and particularly that kind of sequence, which is anytime you're seeing someone teaching someone else how to defend themselves, it's either a woman showing another woman or a man showing another woman.
Exactly.
It's never a woman showing a man. And cleverly what they did was, normally in a movie, that scene would be early on, a man would be showing a woman how to defend herself, and then somewhere in the third act, like Chekhov's gun, because we saw her learn this technique, she will use the technique that she thankfully learned from a strong man to be able to escape some problem in the third act, right? Exactly. Therefore, robbing her of her agency, even while she's doing the act, it's only because a strong man showed her. And what I loved is in this movie, it's exactly the reversal. She was showing him in a way that was clearly not like, I'm trying to fight you and I'm really trying to teach you. It was that they were flirting, and it was about mostly about intimacy without being able to admit yet that they were at that point. And the cool thing is that the subversion of it is that moment in his connection with her, like the real emotional connection he has, and his ability to, I guess what you would say, get tossed around by her and not fight back, is the exact thing he used to help Wyatt. To not fight back and to let his friend do all of that stuff at the end was the thing that Wyatt needed in order for him to believe his friend hadn't gotten taken over. And because he laid back, because he let Wyatt do what he did, Wyatt realized that he wasn't whatever these creatures were, and he was able to see his friend again. So it's a really smart subversion of the expectation that it wasn't learning a violent act that you could use later. It was learning compassion that you could then execute later.
That's a really good point. I hadn't thought about the usual setup, as you put it, or how it robs women of agency. Yeah, that's another great thing in this film to see, just that destruction of expectations. And I'm honestly really liking this film more listening to you guys and discussing this. I wouldn't say I disliked it to start with, but I wasn't a huge fan. I didn't really want to see it again. And now I'm like, man, there's way more in this than I even noticed. So, yeah, it's great. Thank you both so much for this.
Well, this is the point at which I tip my hat and I say my job is done, and then I disappear in a puff of smoke.
Poof. You're a sandwich.
I was going to use the curtain, but I think, the visuals aren't there. We're going to have to go with audio.
Oh, Don, you know you never have to tell me not to pay attention to you. So anyway.
It just comes so naturally, you mean?
Yeah, exactly. You know, another thing that you guys were just talking about with the self-defense things, I really like that it wasn't used for nefarious purposes either. I've seen a couple films where they learn something that could be used for self-defense, and it actually helps you prevent the person from getting out of it. So it's kind of cool that they didn't go that route either, because that's usually the inversion of expectation that I see if I see one. So, yeah.
Yeah, for sure. No, that's a good point. If I were anybody who's listening to this who hasn't seen it, and if you haven't, I don't know why you listened all the way to this point, so we could spoil it for you. But if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it because of most of what we've been talking about. Aside from the themes, I really think, especially for writers, this is a fantastic movie to see how you can successfully look at all of the tropes, which ironically ties back into the book. The reason we wrote the book was to lovingly point out all the tropes and the cliches in those genres so that good writers could see them, or good creators could see them and say, oh, okay, I see that comes up a lot. How can I lean towards that, but then do something different to surprise them? And this movie is a great example of how you can do that. And clearly it also shows you don't need a huge amount of money. You don't need an enormous cast. What you need is a lot of creativity and a few people who are willing to help you out. And that's really all it takes to kind of reinvent a genre in a way that we haven't seen before.
I would like to know more about the practical effects that they used. You know, like you were saying, we didn't get a lot of the special effects, but we get a couple here and there. And I would like to know more about, anything they did practically instead of CGI. And then, of course, there's a couple moments that are like when her face distorts, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they had to put some of the budget into that. But I would like to know, from a writing point of view as well as a filmmaking point of view, what they did to keep those budgets down, and just practical effects in that manner. Overall, I would like to see more openness in how people are doing these things. There's a couple great Instagrammers, but outside of that, you don't really get a lot of that, but every now and then you get somebody who's like, this is how I do horror makeup for $10 or something like that, Well, I would like to see. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I don't know if you know David Sandberg, who he directed Shazam. Before that, he did Lights Out, and that was his premiere. People found him on the internet. He had made a tiny little short film called Lights Out. He'd made several other ones as well. But his stuff is amazing for that, because he'll make the short film, but then he also has all kinds of behind-the-scenes stuff that shows you how he did it. And really? Yeah, and almost everything of his is practical. He has a few visual effects here and there, but I mean, he was making 3 or 4 minute short films for basically no money at all. His stuff is great. It's obviously on a much bigger scale, but if you watch almost anything that Robert Rodriguez has ever made on DVD or Blu-ray, he almost always has what he calls the 5-minute film school, which basically just walks you through some of the more interesting or surprising workarounds that he created for that particular project. So obviously El Mariachi is much longer than 5 minutes because there was an awful lot to talk about there. But Desperado, he basically dissects how to shoot an action sequence dirt cheap. He talks about, I think it's CG effects for Spy Kids 2. So you could probably find those featurettes online. But those are two great resources for people who are interested in how, not just how was this movie great, but how did you do it so inexpensively and still have it be so effective?
Yeah, Lights Out, the short film, was one of my favorite short films for a long time. I liked it so much. So that's great. I had no idea that he does that.
Yeah, I mean, not for every film, but he certainly has several out there that will give you a sense of, the way that he puts those kinds of things together.
Very cool. And I mean, that's another thing. I've seen some that are, I'll say outdated for lack of a better term, but we have so much access to our own computer programs or different editing stuff now that we didn't have even 10 years ago, let alone in the 70s and 80s. And so I need to start looking for more of what they're doing today, I guess, because that fascinates me.
Yeah. I mean, I'm making a small short proof of concept thing for a project I'm working on, and I plugged in a green screen sequence because I learned how to do it by watching YouTube videos, you know. So it's crazy what you can do now with enough patience and enough watching of YouTube clips and watching tutorials.
That's awesome. Very cool. All right, Don, you got anything else for us?
I am good to go, my friend.
And I'm shot as well. What do you got left?
Who? Oh, you're referring to me, I assume, right? I'm the third party here.
Yes, yes.
Nothing else. First of all, I appreciate you guys letting me come on to talk about this. I was joking with my wife earlier when I said, here's how bad I am at marketing. They said I could talk about any movie, and I could have picked Avatar. I could have picked Infinity War. I could have picked a movie that everybody knows and everybody talks about. But instead, I picked a movie that both of the hosts haven't seen and probably no one listening has seen. So if this is your least downloaded episode, I apologize. And I'm also not doing a very good job of publicizing myself. But the instinct in me to share a great movie that not enough people are talking about always outweighs any of my other concerns. And I just think Perry Blackshear and his team did such an amazing piece of work here that much like movies like, I don't know if you guys have ever seen Pontypool, but that's another low budget gem that not enough people are talking about. And so anytime I get a chance, even if I'm publicizing my own work, I also want to plug somebody else who's doing amazing things that not enough people are appreciating.
No, that's awesome. And a lot of our listeners, I try to put out coming Monday, this is the film we're going to watch. Because if you haven't seen it in 40 years and you want to see it again, or if you've never seen it before, it gives people time before the episode drops. But that's the number one feedback that I get. It's, hey, I had never seen this movie and I watched it because it was going to be on your show. So this could actually work out really well for what you're trying to do.
Excellent. And we should tell anybody who has Amazon Prime, it's available free streaming on Amazon Prime.
Yes.
So
what? I paid that guy $20 for no reason? Oh, man. No.
Well, that's the last time I make a bootleg for you, James.
No, it's not. But yeah, so go ahead.
I was just going to say, while you're over at Amazon, if you wanted to, you could pre-order a copy of my book, Spoiler Alert. And also, if you look up my name, Chris Vander Kaay, it's a weird Dutch last name, but it's VanderKaay. I also have 3 other books that I co-wrote with my wife and co-writer Kathleen Killian Fernandez. They're about the history and philosophy of horror film and science fiction film, and they're a lot of fun. So I think there's a lot of stuff there for fans of your show that they would appreciate. So feel free to if you thought this conversation and the movie we talked about was interesting and worthwhile, grab something else that I talk about in one of our other books.
Awesome. So tell us about your other books. What are they called?
Oh, okay. So, the first one is called The Anatomy of Fear: Conversations with Cult Horror and Science Fiction Filmmakers. And we talked to 25 filmmakers from really across a lot of bounds. We talked to Eric Red, who made The Hitcher and 100 Feet, and he wrote Near Dark. We also talked to Jeff Burr, who directed Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3. Talked to guys like J.T. Petty and Larry Fessenden, who are very well known in the newer indie horror scene. So that one was mostly just conversations with the filmmakers about their body of work. The second book that we did was called Horror Films by Subgenre, and that one is a special place in my heart. We basically divided the field of horror into 75 distinct subgenres, things like basement horror and abduction horror and things like that. And we talk about the psychology of the genre, what are some of the sort of the signposts that it's the genre, right? The 5 or 6 things that always crop up, and then sort of exemplary samples of those kinds of movies, 4 or 5 titles that you might have seen, or maybe if you haven't seen, these are great examples of what the subgenre does. So that's Horror Films by Subgenre. And then our third one is Indie Science Fiction Cinema Now, Indie Science Fiction Cinema Today. And that's basically independent science fiction films from the year 2000 to when it came out, which was 2016. And that's both a sort of a conversation book with the filmmakers, but also observations of trends that have happened in modern science fiction because of the changes in the world.
Very cool.
And then, of course, the most important one, Spoiler Alert, which I have to say, well, I love all the other books. This is the first one we've ever done the others are just straight print books. This one, we worked with Lawrence King, which is a fantastic company out of the UK. They're a London-based publisher. They do deluxe style art books, and they're really beautiful. And I'm super proud of this new book. So Spoiler Alert, The Badass Book of Movie Plots is our most recent one.
Very cool. And where can people find you on social media?
The best place to go would be Twitter, because I hate myself, and so I spend a lot of time on there. My Twitter handle.
I love Twitter.
I do too. And I think that means we hate ourselves. But my handle is at CK, the letters, and then my last name, Vander Kaay. So it's CK Vander Kaay. I mostly talk about movies there, but I occasionally shamelessly plug myself, as I have been for the last hour or so.
Very cool. All right. So we're going to go ahead and wrap this up. I want to thank you for coming on and for, one, making me watch this film, and two, for talking about it and making me think about it so much that I have to go watch it again. That very rarely happens, and I really appreciate it when it does. So
glad to have done so, and I really appreciate you guys having me on the show. Thank you so much.
No, thank you for coming on. Appreciate you.
So next week, we're going to be joined by Jared Rivet, and we are going to talk Poltergeist. So that should be fun. Until then, as always, I am James Sabata.
And I am Don Guillory.
And we'll see you next week on the Necronama.com.